Do you know anything about the English colonists that came to America? How much do you know about the English and then later Europeans coming to what we now call the United States? What do you think about immigration? Do you believe that all people are allowed to make their home wherever they want? At what point is it okay to leave your doors open to anyone that needs a place to stay? Would you let them eat your food? And would you give them monthly checks, whatever they need? Would you help their sick? Or would you make war with those people? There's a fine line in understanding the intention and morals of a people. In history, what do you think of the personalities of the people that came from Europe to the Americas, to what we now know as the United States? And did you ever think of the personalities of the people, of the natives that were already on the land that now we call the United States? We seem to lump everybody together into one being, one personality. That's like me saying the people of Chicago are assholes. Not considering all the individual personalities that reside there. I'm going to go over some notes about the English colonists. I'm trying to be as objective as I can. And then people can draw their own conclusions from those facts. I'm going to pull a lot of information from sources from other historians and right from the horse's mouth as well, from memoirs and logbooks and stuff like that. So here goes. There was a queen. There was a virgin queen. She was never married or had any children. They called her the Virgin Queen. She gave her soul and her life to what she believed in. And at the time, that was England and her country. When Sir Walter Raleigh journeyed to the Americas with an unsuccessful attempt to start the English colony, he named the land that he witnessed at the time Virginia, after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, which is a really cool person in history if you want to look her up. But we'll get into her in different videos. He traveled along the coast of present-day North Carolina to Florida, and from the late 16th to early 17th centuries, the English called the whole eastern American coast Virginia, from Canada to Florida. And Raleigh grew close to Queen Elizabeth, and therefore she allowed him to go to the Americas to set foot on land and colonize there. Also set up a place to launch attacks against the Spanish, but they weren't doing too well together at the time. Like in my other videos, the Africans were, going against each other. The Islamists were going against each other, and all these different sects of people are always going against each other. All these bodies of people. So Spain and England weren't doing too well at the time. So then, in 1584, Raleigh had 2 English ships make their way for the Americas. They landed on Roanoke Island, and they stayed there for a couple months before returning back to England. Then in 1585, Raleigh sent about 115 English people to the island called Roanoke, which is off the coast of North Carolina. But back then it was called Virginia, as you just heard me say. The whole coast was called Virginia at the time. The settlers didn't have much success with crops, and they used the excuse of infertile soil, and they produced little crops, not a lot of food, so the colonists relied on the Algonquin sect of people, the natives of the local area, to help them with the food. And an Englishman named Ralph Lane was appointed governor of the settlement. He was previously a sheriff in Ireland. He was an expert in building fortifications, which he had then built at Roanoke, including a jail that he had people imprisoned in under Lane's mostly authoritarian governance. He's like, get into jail, you bitch. But Lane's attitude and control ran into some battles with the local natives of the area. He wasn't just an asshole to his own people, he was an asshole to the Indians as well. And he was getting food from these guys, and then he was probably demanding it. And you know, if it hit the Shan, and Lane got into a fight with the Powhatan chief Wingina about the food supply, in which that battle led to the chief's death. And I think he killed a couple of his chiefs, his men as well. And so the relationship between the Europeans and the natives was then broken, which led to more problems and battles between the two different groups of people, so on and so forth. Then so Ralph later soon said, hey man, we got no food, we're fighting with these people, let's get the hell out of here. So they made their way back to England, or to Ireland. That's where Ralph Lane was from. But then in the year 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh brought a second group of people to the Americas, and this time with John White as the civilian leader. This time there were 94 people, including 17 women and 9 children. And they were planning to drop the people north of the Chesapeake Bay because the land was fertile and the natives less alienated. So he's like, you know what, let's not go back over there, and let's go where the food might be better grown. But the English mariners wanted to rush back to sea to seize booty from the Spanish. So you know what, we're not making it to Chesapeake Bay, we're gonna just drop you off here at Roanoke. Good luck, you bastards. So we just left these people on the island there. But eventually John White became the governor and started making good relationships with the neighboring Indians at the time. And so that was looking good. But they didn't have all the food that they wanted, and they weren't prepared. And a lot of people ask, why would they send people from England to the coast of America with no supplies? So people got sick and hungry. The natives gave them food, but obviously not medicine, because a lot of people got really sick. Then there was a guy named George Howe that was killed by the Indians while out gathering food. So things weren't very perfect over there. The colonists were in harsh conditions, and so they had John White make his back to Europe to get some supplies and whatever else they needed. So it was 115 people sitting on this island with no transportation, no food. People were sick. There was even a baby that was born there. They named her Virginia Dare, which was the first child born and baptized in northeastern American soil at the time. But after the Spanish and English War, that was going on in the late 16th century, the war had cleared a way for John White to make his way back to Roanoke Island a few years later. So he left these people on an island for a few years with no transportation. It's crazy. But I mean, there was a war going on, so he's not like he's going to drive right through it. So when he came back, all the colonists were gone. So they call this the Lost Colony. And over the last 500 years, the shoreline had risen a couple hundred meters to hide any kind of evidence of where these people might be. A lot of this stuff is underwater. So then in 1606, more people came. There was a stock company called a joint stock company called the Virginia Company of investors that they're investors that had specific plans for colonists to search for minerals in a passageway that led to the other side of the continent, American continent, to Asia. So they came to America, and they called that settlement Jamestown. There were 104 people 100 men and 4 boys, passengers on a ship named Susan Constant that was sent out on December 20th, 1606, the Common Era. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Christopher Newport, and they had written a rationale and purpose for the colonization before they got there. They said in 3 parts. They were there to spread Christianity, build on the land, and search for minerals, and set up for possible trading. On April 26, they finally reached Chesapeake Bay. They sent scouts on land to search for a place to settle for 17 days. But it wasn't until a couple weeks later, on May 13th, that they had dropped anchor at a place called Jamestown. Jamestown had no potable water, and its marshy landscapes bred great clouds of flies and mosquitoes that feasted greedily on warm-blooded flesh. And there at Jamestown, people started to die off from wars with Indians, famine and diseases, and mosquitoes. There was a guy named George Percy who wrote of some of the first Indians they encountered on the 10th day at the Chesapeake. And here's what he wrote. At night, when we were going aboard, there came the savages creeping upon all 4 from the hills like bears, with their bows in their mouths, charged us very desperately in their faces, hurt Captain Gabriel Archer in both of his hands, and a sailor in 2 places of the body very dangerous. After they had spent their arrows and the filthy sharpness of our shot, they retired into the woods with great noise, and left us so. On the 13th day we came to our ships at Cape Comfort, where we saw 5 savages running on the shore. Presently, the captain caused the shallop to be manned, so rolling to the shore, the captain called to them in sign of friendship, but they were at first very timbersome, until they saw the captain lay his hand on his heart. Upon that they laid down their bows and arrows, and came very boldly to us, making signs to come to the shore, to their town, which the savages called this town Powhatan. The Indians that these people encountered were called the Powhatan Indians. The Powhatan were a Stone Age people where stone was not plentiful and most trees are hard wood. They were a set of Beringian descendants that made their way to the furthest east coast of North America. The Powhatan were the largest Algonquin-speaking group of the eastern Virginia. Powhatan married men smoked tobacco after drying it in a fire. The only domesticated animal they had were dog. The Indians ate a lot of fish, oysters, and crab, but they didn't eat horseshoe crab. Powhatan didn't like the horseshoe crab. Fish and shellfish were abundant in Virginia before they got all decimated by the populations, wiped them out, and all the Virginian Algonquin groups lived near these resources and near the major rivers, in which were also good for communication. The Powhatan also bathed in these rivers. They washed their hands before meals, it is said. So in these rivers, they were cleaning themselves, trading with and communicating and transporting things down these rivers. The Powhatan did not use any type of currency or economic specialization, as far as we know. The most expensive thing that they had were their dugout canoes, in which were 4 feet deep and some 50 feet long. Their cutting tools really affect their way of life. They really desired iron from the English, but the English observed that the Powhatan Indian men lacked skills in farming. It was more of a woman's job. The English thought that they were crazy for it. The men did the fishing and the women did the farming. They either speared their fish or shot them with bows and arrows to a line, and the women were out doing the farming. I wonder how those women identified. And the Powhatan men did on occasion hunting, in which gave them the protein and clothes for their elite Powhatan Indians. They were very good hunters. They hunted deer and used the skins for clothes. Everyone was dressed besides the girls that didn't reach puberty yet, and some boys at home were walking around naked. They hunted beavers for the meat and the tail. Beaver, turtle, rattlesnake was a delicacy to them. Venison was their favorite meat. After deer and food sources ran low, the whole families moved to areas where the deer was not so overhunted. They also did the slash and burn technique that most other tribes did around the Americas. So when the English arrived, they seen a lot of burnt stumps, even burnt to the ground. And they're like, man, why is everything burning here? The natives had the slash and burn technique where they would cut down everything and burn it. And then when the new life grows back, then the new animals come back to eat that stuff, and then the Indians hunt those animals. This slash and burn technique goes all the way to Mexico. They all do similar things. The Powhatan eating times were irregular. They ate all day. They ate as much as they wanted or could when the food was available. But when food was scarce, they were very patient and waiting for the next meal. And before every meal, they recited a prayer and threw the first bit of food into a fire as an offering, somewhat of a Thanksgiving prayer. The English noticed that they prayed thanks after the meal as well. The Powhatan based their calendar system on annual cycles of plants. They had 5 seasons. They considered a new year with the return of the geese and that migrated in the winter. One English observer noticed that they added up twice as many days. The Indians wore loincloths to cover them from front to back. If they couldn't trade for leather loincloths, they used grass instead. When people went into the forest, they wore leggings with moccasins and sandals. And when the weather got cold, they bundled up in cloaks and match coats. The women and men painted themselves every day. Their color was mulberry red. They liked mulberry red. The Powhatan women loved to wear tattoos. The young girls that didn't get to the age of puberty were naked. These girls also had their hair cut very short. Later in the years, they plucked out their hair out of their body parts, their privates and their armpits. They did this for cleanliness. The men plucked out hair out of the right side of their head, while the other side of their head was long hair with ornaments hanging in it, usually long feathers. The diplomats also wore antlers when meeting with the English. The women shaved the men, and it was seldom that men had beards or mustache. Powhatan himself had a gray mustache and a beard. So can you imagine coming to a land and a guy comes out with antlers on his head as a diplomat to greet you? That'd be pretty wild. And today, of course we see pictures of it, but like just imagine somebody had never ever seen something like that before. They'd be like, what the heck is this? Okay, the Powhatan. Boys, mothers, and fathers trained them to hunt at an early age. The mothers would feed the children in the morning until they could pass an archery test. When he got enough food, the father would start to take him hunting and getting him ready for some manhood test that the tribe put on every young adult through. It was called the Kuskana. And this Kuskana test that they put these young children through, some of them did not survive. The English observed it as child sacrifice. The boys attended a dance ceremony. They were then taken to the woods for several months and fed some hallucinogenic drug, possibly some Jimson weed from Virginia. They were going crazy, so the elders put the boys in cages until they settled down. After weeks of total madness, the boys who survived were taken out of the cage and had been given a few weeks to get off the drug and come to their senses again. And when they came to, they were taken back home in their zombie-like state, seen as men, and they were considered men at that point. And they had become men, so they lost their old life in the woods. They left their childhood in the woods with a hallucinogenic drug. They were supposed to forget everything about their childhood. If they mentioned that they remember anything about their childhood, even their parents, they would have to start the ritual all over again. Hard times for young Powhatan Indian people. For young Powhatan men, hard times. They wanted all the boys to grow up to be good hunters and soldiers. When they wanted to grow the community, they would steal women and children from other tribes. Sometimes they would torture one of the captives to death. If a boy tortured a man to death, he looked better into entering his manlyhood. The Powhatan and all their neighbors tortured war captives to death. They would tie a captive to a tree, and either a woman or a man would get a seashell, and start cutting off the limbs of the captive and throwing his body parts into the fire as he could see. So these are the Powhatan that the English came to and met. There's a little bit of a backstory there. I got a book some time ago called The Powhatan Indians of Virginia, Their Traditional Culture by Helen C. Roundtree. Most of my sources are from that book and then other notes. But if you want to know more about the Powhatan and more into detail, you can get that book. Pretty good book. Very interesting. So, back to Virginia and the English. During the time in early Virginia, the colonists and the Indians suffered one of the worst droughts that took place in 7 centuries. So, they got there and they were like, man, where's the rain? Colonists were begging the Indians for food, but the Indians were short of food since there was a drought. Christopher Newport went to England for more supplies, food, and people. When he returned, only 37 out of 104 of the colonists were still alive. In 1624 CE, only 1,275 of the 10,000 of the colonists that came to Virginia had survived. Of those remaining colonists, they were distraught that they were going through all these terrible times, and they were angry that they didn't get what they expected, gold, silver, and plus a good place to start a new life in the Americas. And the Indians, the native relations between them were not very peaceful either. The death rate slowed down in the later 1620s as people started to learn from mistakes and make more rational decisions. But the massacre of 1622 with the Powhatan Indians killed 347 of those colonists, which was a quarter of the colonist population at the time. I'll do a different video on. So George Percy mentions that the colonists had died from famine and Indian war, but some modern-day scientists are determining that the colonists had died from drinking the dirty water that Percy does mention amongst a few other things. The water around Jamestown was filled with slime and filth on calm days, but other days there was so much salt in the water. In result, they were poisoned with the salt and dysentery and typhoid. A lot of people died that way in early Virginia. The early colonists lived a communalistic life. Nobody owned land or did much work on the land. In the beginning colonies, nobody wanted to work. The men said they were too tired, and the women said they weren't strong enough, and that the children would rather play. As a result, some historians said that the men had played bowling in the street, and women sat around and talked, and nobody did any type of work because nobody wanted to support anybody else. And a lot of people died because of this communalistic experiment. And life for the early settlers didn't change until they were granted private property to where they started to take care of their own belongings. But there was still a poverty problem because private property was only allowed to certain members of society at first. Both Virginia and Massachusetts started out as communalistic experiments that all drew from the same pot that was never replenished. Massachusetts never really adopted slavery to the extent that Virginia did, but still some became one of the most prosperous societies on earth at the time. Massachusetts. All in all, the end result of communalism to private property, Virginia was characterized by having a very rich class of people and a very poor class of people. But Massachusetts had only a middle class of people, with a very few poor. But at first, right off the bat, Virginia and Massachusetts had starving Englishmen because of their communalistic experiments. Nobody replenished the pot that everybody drew from. But for a time in 1608 to 1609, Captain John Smith commanded the colony and forced the colonists to work 6 hours a day in the fields. And then he got a lot of people complaining. John Smith said something like, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. Those who do not work, then you might as well just watch us eat. Everybody's like, hell with that, man. But eventually, at some point, John Smith burned himself with gunpowder on his leg or something like that. And he had to return to England. So he wasn't around much longer after that. But he was pushing people in the beginning, pushing people to work. Just imagine what would have happened if he would have stayed. because all hell broke loose after he went back to England. That's right. John Smith was kind of pushy, kind of probably a jag boss. Nobody liked him. One of those kind of guys. But he got people to work, to eat. They probably got him to work really hard. And if I bet you it was probably really hard. He's like, if you don't dig that hole, you ain't gonna get no food. Even though he worked all day, it's probably something along those lines. And then this is in 1609, and then, believe it or not, that next winter in 1609 and 1610 became something called the starving time, where a lot of people died. So in 1609, a lot of people came to Virginia. There were an additional 500 colonists sent to America, but only 400 made it to America alive. A lot of people died on the way there. I think we heard this story before. And because of bad storms, it knocked Sir Thomas Gates off route with the other men. They had lost touch with their captain and arrived very, very weak to Virginia and sick and hungry. And so when they showed up to Virginia, to Jamestown, they ate up much of the little food that the colonists had on land. And while the winter was approaching, many had died from famine or sickness or disease. Eventually, there were only 60 people left out of the near 500 people of the colony. They called it a starving time. When spring finally arrived, many people tried to make their way back to England, but a lot were turned back around to stay. There's a written document from the time of the hardships and the cannibalism in the colony during those early years. Somebody wrote about this time in 1609, 1610, which was October 1609 to March 1610. Okay, so here's what the guy said. And the loss of our ships, of 500 within 6 months. After Captain Smith's departure, there remained not past 60 men, women and children, most miserable and poor creatures. And those were preserved, for the most part, by roots, herbs, acorns, walnuts, berries, now and then a little fish. They that had starch in these extremities made no small use of it, yea, even the very skins of our horses. Nay, so great was our famine that a savage would slew and be buried. The poor sort took him up again to eat him, and so did divers one another boiled and stewed with roots and herbs. And one amongst the rest did kill his wife, powdered her, and eaten part of her before it was known, for which he was executed, and he well deserved. Now whether she was better roasted, or boiled, or carbonated, grilled, I do not know. But of such dish as powdered wife, I never heard of. This was the time which still to this day, 1624, we call a starving time. It were too vile to say, and scarce to be believed, what we endured, but the occasion was our own, for want of providence, industry, and government. So basically humans, when they get hungry, they start eating people. As you can see there, they were digging up Indian graves and then eating their wives and so on and so forth to get food. And most of them died anyways in the starving time after they kicked out the captain. And they had their communalistic lifestyle. But with the arrival of Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale, it was a fortunate choice of governors to help turn things around and create order in these colonies. Gates replaced Lord de War as governor in 1611. Gates had instituted a series of regulations that subjected the colonists to martial law and discipline. Dale was appointed marshal, and additional laws and ordinances that were eventually called the Laws Divine, Morale, and Martial. By 1612, they were published by William Sarchi in 1612, and were strictly enforced by himself, Thomas Dale, the Marshal. They had people starting to plant staple crops. They also introduced a sort of private land tenure. Sir Thomas Dale in 1611 arrived and helped Jamestown move from a communalistic life to a land ownership, as did William Bradley did for Massachusetts in 1614. Once the people learned to keep up with their own land and produce on their own property, the streets started to empty, and the bowlers and the people playing in the drunken streets started to clean up. To stay alive and eat, English had become servants for Indian tribes. But when communalistic life was changed to land ownership, the Indians' English slaves went back to live with their own people. The thieves and beggars of the colonies started to dissipate after they learned how to work and build their own forts. Even the women and children started to help with the farming and cleaning up. The starving time had ended around this time. Capitalism and land ownership beat out the authoritarian communalistic life. Relationships between the Powhatan Indians and the English were rough, so in 1613, Gates and Dale were seeking a way to make peace with the Powhatan. Samuel Argall captured Powhatan daughter Pocahontas, and she married John Rolfe. At that time, the Indians and English were finally at peace. Sir Francis Drake introduced tobacco into England, but John Rolfe wanted to get his hands into the crop and start to export it. But the Virginia tobacco crop was way too harsh for anybody to want it, to prefer it over tobacco from the islands. So Rolfe got a West Indian strain and then started a successful business of growing the tobacco instead. All of the Virginia colonists started to grow tobacco and export it. People credit John Rolfe for saving the colony's future. So, communalism to capitalism and private property and the sale of tobacco is what saved the colonists of America, which eventually evolved to the United States. So far, what we see here. Eventually, the tobacco turned the colony into a successful system, but then people started to get people to work for them as indentured servants. These contract laborers would eventually complete their servitude contract and then receive the promised land that was awarded to them after their servitude. By 1614, many of the servitude contracts were expiring, and Thomas Dale then offered the freed servants to rent 3 acres of land for 1 month of service, plus to donate corn to the common store. Besides the rental to the servants, he was offering 1 year of free rent and 7 acres of land to the families arriving from England to Virginia. Dale did this in hopes of more food production, but many of these new colonists were only thinking about growing tobacco and making it rich, rather than planting food crops. It wasn't until after 1616 when people were paid in land rather than money. That's when the colony took an even better direction. But in 1624, the colony went bankrupt anyways. So screw 1624. But in 1614, settlements were widely scattered, and there became a lot of confusion over land titles. So Sir Edwin Sandys, the newly chosen treasurer, thought of reorganizing the entire colonial operation. A series of instruction and commissions were started, called the Great Charter of 1618. It was to reform the land tenures, to improve local administration and supplant the laws divine morale and martial with English common law. And then in 1619, Sandys authorized Sir George Yeardley as governor to call together an assembly of state and Burgesses elected by the colony's freemen of the House of Burgesses. These 27 men, the governor George Yardley, 6 councilors, and 20 Burgesses, ushered in a new era of colonial government. But in 1622, the Indians killed some 350 settlers and plunged Virginia into warfare that lasted a decade. The English crown stepped in and took over the colony, making Virginia England's first royal colony. But besides those laws and those things that were written up that I had already mentioned, there was a charter in 1606 that was written up by King James of England. It first spoke of how the settlers, when born in America, would be born with all the freedoms and liberties to that of the people of England and English colonies. Since James said he owned the land that the people on the American continent, that they were his subtenants of his. In the beginning of the Charter of 1606 text, he suggested that the group would divide into 2 separate colonies, the London Company and the Plymouth Company. They were to find decent land and settle wherever they saw fit. He tells them to start propagating the Christian religion to the Indians. He referred to the current natives as uncivilized and savage people, to where the religion would save them from an uncivilized world. He tells the colonists to build and fortify to keep themselves with good defense. And lastly, he told them to dig for metals, get some money. Therefore, upon the findings, they would have to pay a percentage of tax back to England. These were some of the laws and direction for the colony in the beginning. They would all have to obey by and sign their consent to this document. So some of the first laws in 1606. So the first colony would include Sir Thomas Gates. The second colony would include Thomas Hanham, Raleigh Gilbert, William Parker, and George Popham. Those of the town of Plymouth in the county of Devon. King James said that wherever they find land fit, they shall settle, and that they shall have all the land, soils, grounds, havens, ports, rivers, mines, minerals, woods, marshes, waters, fishing, commodities, and whatsoever. From the first seed of their plantation and habitation of the seed of 50 like English miles along the coast of Virginia, and they were not to trespass or inhabit or plant anywhere beyond those boundaries without a special permit from the Council of the Colony. So there was laws there. There was laws going on right in the beginning. So it wasn't just like a bunch of wild Englishmen walking around. The Charter also explains that the 2 colonies should have each a council which shall govern and order all matters and causes which shall rise, grow, and happen to or within the several colonies according to such laws, ordinance, and instructions, and shall be in the behalf given and signed with our hand or signed manual, and pass under the privy seal of our realm of England. With this, the king told the colonies that they were to have a government with laws and to sign the charter and the agreement and understanding in Jamestown or in Virginia. But another crazy thing here is that the colonists were also going to have 13 people belong to a council that would be established in England called the Council of Virginia. And the Council of Virginia in England would have superior managing and direction for the government in Virginia when needed. So the new colonists are there to dig for gold, copper, and silver. They keep whatever they find, but must give 1/5 of gold and silver to the crown, and 1/15 of the copper shall be also given to them as well. And it was written like this is how it's exactly written. Should be given to us, our heirs or successors, for or in respect of the same. And that concludes with, but if anyone within the precincts of the colony goes beyond the borders or at sea without a license to trade or sell, the King of England shall take all their goods, including the ship, from that person. It was pretty rough back then for them people. King James granted the colonists freedom and land grants, the ability to search for their own metals and make their own currency from it, but paying a percentage of it back to England as tax. King James asked if they could spread the Christian faith to the local natives of the country, while living peacefully, not to break any laws, because the local authority of Virginia was granted rights by the crown to do so as saw fit to the crook, the thief, or the sort that breaks laws. Though there were new charters after the 1606 charter, 3 altogether, the charter of 1606, 1609, and 1612, were just basically the same thing, but the only difference was one was just amending more land territory rather than legislation was the difference of the 3. It was about land and wealth back then, at that time. So who was this guy King James at the time? King James was born in Scotland on June 19, 1566. He was the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and his father named Lord Darnley, who was mysteriously assassinated. Prior to King James becoming King of Scotland at age 12, named King James VI, he was tutored and learned to be fluent in Greek, French, and Latin and English. He studied arithmetic, composition, cosmography, dialects, geography, history, rhetoric, and theology. He read a lot and didn't go out much, and he was seen as socially awkward, but he was thought of as a serious scholar by the time he was in his teens. In 1589, King James married Anne, the daughter of Frederick II, King of Denmark. They had 9 children together, but only 3 survived infancy. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth of England died, and King James, the cousin of Queen Elizabeth, became King James I of England, while the King James VI of Scotland as well. He combined the 2 countries into one and named it Great Britain at that time. Then brought England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland under one government. He ended the war between Spain and England to bring peace and prosperity to England during his rule. People tried to assassinate King James for 4 different times unsuccessfully. November 5th marks a day to remember when they caught Guy Fawkes trying to blow up the place with King James inside. Some people referred to him as a heretic. Some people called King James a bisexual. But that rumor didn't start until about 25 years after his death. You know how people talk. There is no historical evidence of anyone ever calling King James a homosexual during his lifetime, only after his death. Some have even said that King James was a black man. Scholars say that people just tried to discredit King James' Bible. In 1604, King James wanted to write a better version of the Bible while gathering 44 linguist scholars to translate it. They split into 6 groups, translating the original document while comparing a bunch of versions at the same time. And in 1611, 7 years of translation and hard work with proper phrasing, they gave the Bible to King James, making him the author, since he brought them all together to do it. The book has been regarded as one of the best books ever written in the English language. Yeah, whatever. Jamestown was then named after King James. I guess I should have mentioned it earlier, right? But, okay, so back to Virginia, or Jamestown. Not many women made it to Virginia at first, mostly unskilled men that were accompanied by a few artisans. A few women made it to land around the year 1607. It wasn't until 1620 that Sir Edward Sandys had 90 single women arrive in Jamestown. The plantation can never flourish till families be planted and the respective wives and children fix the people on the soil, is what he said. The first women to arrive in Jamestown in 1608 were Mistress Forrest and Anne Burras, the maid of Forrest. Anne Burras married John Leyden, in which was the first wedding in Jamestown, and they had 4 daughters together. There's some info for you. A few women named Temperance Flowerdew and Joanne Pierce, and her daughters, also named Joanne, who eventually became the 3rd wife of John Rolfe after Pocahontas died, were among the 400 people that arrived to Jamestown just prior to the starving time, in which killed the majority of the settlers. Temperance went back to England only to return as the wife of Sir George Yardley. All 3 of these women survived the starving times of Jamestown. Notice that they were all at some point married to or associated with some of the elite of the time. So that's how they stayed alive. Of the little food that the settlers had during the starving time, these people were all kept alive. These elite, these governors and people on top, they hid all the food possibly. Englishmen received land as dividends for their time in Virginia, while some of these men requested allotments of land specifically for their wives. There's a quote from somebody, from one of these early Virginians, that wrote this: "In a new plantation, it is not known whether the man or the woman be more necessary." So that's pretty cool. So they weren't separating each other back then. So therefore, women were given land just like the men were. And the women were referred to as the ancient planters, they called them. They may have been had been to Virginia by 1616 and meet the other criteria to be awarded these plots of land. So this is what was going on in early Virginia. And in 1621, there were an additional 57 women that arrived in Jamestown. They were all ages 16 to 28 years old. They wanted to come to Jamestown to start a new life. They were the daughters of artisans and gentry. By the time of their arrival, there were about 6 men to every woman. And these women didn't come as indentured servants, but many of them worked with laundry and making clothes. Early Jamestown was known as a place to come to start a new life. It was also a place where the vagabonds and homeless were sent to. Between the years 1617 and 1623, there were about 250 destitute children that were sent to the Virginia colony. And in 1618, London parishes supported the shipment of 100 boys and girls to Virginia. They thought that they would have a better life, learning a trade while living in Virginia, rather than living on the streets in London, eating pigeons, or whatever they were eating. It is possible that all the children learned to read and write while studying religion. Additionally, it is possible that the boys learned trades while the girls learned housewife duties. But there are several boys that served as interpreters for the colony. There was Samuel Collier in 1607 that went off to live with the Indians to learn their language and other things from the Indians to translate back to the colony. There was Thomas Savage, and he was 13 years old, and Henry Spellman, that was 14 years old. And they took the roles of interpreters, hanging out and living with the Indians. As Henry Spellman got older, he recorded a lot of the important writings of the Indians. I got a book on it. I'm gonna go over it in a different video. So the settlers built a lot of churches in Jamestown from the year 1607 to 1610. The first church was made of a sail that was tied between trees. Then they later erected a wooden structure that resembled a barn. The first church burned down in 1608, but was rebuilt soon after. Lord de la Warr arrived in 1610 and didn't like the structure, so he renovated it and repaired it to his liking. And in 1617, Captain Samuel Argall built a similar church in a nearby location. This church still stands as a historical site in historic Jamestown to this day. This church is also where the first General Assembly met in 1619, House of Burgesses. But in 1610, it was martial law that stated that all people were required by law to attend the church service. The first little barn structure was possibly so small that it cramped too many people inside, so that possibly building a different church to fit more people is why Argall built the second church. And violators that didn't attend church were punished by losing their food rations, public shaming, or even execution. So if you didn't go to church, you might have been killed. Whew. You're not going to eat today, bastard. Didn't make it to church. The settlers were as zealous and spiritual as the Indian tribes. It seemed very common in the 17th century that most people from every sect believed in a supernatural being, whether it be in the sky or underground, or even a spirit in a tree or a rock. So So these are some of the things and rules and things that were going on with the people in early America, or what will become the United States. On September 4th, 1619, Captain John Woodlief wrote instructions to people that he traveled to Virginia with. He also mentioned all of the items that he brought with to Virginia. So here's all the things they brought from England to Virginia. 33 pounds of soap was included on this first trip. The provisions included 8,000 biscuits, bread, 160 pounds of butter, 127 pounds of bacon, 33 pounds of soap, 5.5 tons of beer, and 6 tons of cider, 60 bushels of peas, and many other things. So there's some of the evidence that shows that of the things that they brought. They didn't just come in empty-handed. And if you're wondering what they did bring, those are some of the things. And John Woodlief included shirts, suits, caps, 200 pairs of shoes, 200 buttons, and other things for clothes. For the kitchen, he included 48 trenchers, dishes, bowls, cups, kettles, pans, and many other things for the kitchen. Lastly, he mentioned guns and swords to be brought with. Oh, and he also mentioned to bring 2 Bibles and many other religious books, 6,000 beads to trade with the Indians, and lastly, he mentioned to bring garden seeds and paper with ink to write. So he's like, "Hey, man, we're gonna start making it better over there. We're gonna start planting food, and got soap. We got things to cook with." He also mentions in the middle of the section to bring axes and hatchets of many kind. Saws, hoes, shovels, pickaxe, crowbars, reaping hooks, hammers, chisels, pliers, nails, latchets, glue, ropes, fishing tools, and etc. So they didn't come empty-handed. If you think they're just a bunch of stupid Englishmen showing up with nothing, they had things. Woodlief had traveled to Virginia in 1608, 1609. He saw the hardships that were faced with at the times. So he returned to Virginia well equipped the second time in 1619. He brought tools to fish with, soap, the pans to cook with, tools to build homes with, and plus he brought seeds to plant gardens, with, and beads to trade with, among other things. All seemed well in 1619 when they arrived, for at least a couple years, until the massacre of 1622, in which almost ruined it all. But it wasn't good for everybody. There was an English indentured servant that wrote. He said they were treated terribly in Virginia. Like most servants and slaves, the English servants had terrible hardships that killed most of them, while the living had suffered intolerably. There was a letter written by Richard Frethorn that spoke of the harsh treatments and malnutrition of himself and his fellow servants. In 1623, he had a letter sent to his parents telling them about how terrible it was of being an indentured servant. He was starved, he was robbed, and sickened, and witnessed many terrible things. The culture and mannerisms of the 17th century seemed quite horrible in regards to working for someone. On January 24th, 1624, William Much was in court because he was arguing with his master for his payment, in which they called freedom dues. He was expecting corn for payment and was probably hungry. The fact is that people had to fight for food and payment back then. I have a lot of notes and sources on this time period, and I'm going to make other separate videos on it, like I had mentioned already, about a few particular things. But I wanted to just give a background what was going on and who was in early America at the time that eventually evolved to the United States. Some of their first laws, the indentured servants we mentioned, their churches, the way they were to people, the way they handled each other. If you didn't show up to church, they wouldn't feed you. Pretty crazy things were going on back then in those early days. And how communalism evolved into capitalism. How the society says, okay, let's let's start working here. And things started to work out. So anyways, that's Virginia for you. Early America.